Hi, I'm Yvonne, and my presentation today is on Bell Hooks. I'll talk a little bit about her legacy and then examine the introduction and first chapter of her 1994 book, Teaching to Transgress: Education as the Practice of Freedom. Bell Hooks is often described as an American scholar, prolific and trailblazing author, poet, feminist, cultural critic, professor, and activist whose work examined the deep connections between race, class, and gender. She received her doctorate in literature from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and she taught at the University of Southern California, Yale University, Oberlin College, the City College of New York, and Berea College in Kentucky. Hooks died in December 2021, but her works, including more than 30 books on literary criticism, children's fiction, self-help, memoir, and poetry, tackling subjects like education, capitalism, and American history, and also love and friendship, continue to garner an audience, and her book, All About Love, originally published in 1999, is currently number 10 on the New York Times bestseller list for nonfiction. For this part of my presentation, I'll discuss Dr. Hooks' education and career aspirations, her interest in feminism, the influences of Paulo Freire and Thich Nhat Hanh, and her views on pedagogy. Growing up, teaching was a default career choice in what Hooks called the apartheid South. Black girls from working-class families had three choices: marry, be a maid, or be a school teacher. Because of her zeal for learning, it was assumed that she would become a teacher. Hooks also wanted to write. At her all-black grade school, teaching others was political because it was rooted in anti-racist struggle. At her school, learning was revolution. Teachers nurtured intellect so students could become scholars, thinkers, and cultural workers. She says, "We learned early that our devotion to learning, to a life of the mind, was a counter-hegemonic act, a fundamental way to resist every strategy of white racist colonization." Her teachers, she says, were enacting a revolutionary pedagogy of resistance that was profoundly anti-colonial. Hooks loved being a student, she loved learning, and school was a place of ecstasy. But school life changed with racial integration. Knowledge became about information, obedience, the reinforcement of racist stereotypes, and the importance of not being zealous to learn because it could be interpreted as a threat to white authority. Learning for her was no longer about the practice of freedom. Here, she lost her love of school. Here, she learned the difference between education as the practice of freedom and education that merely strived to reinforce domination. Her experience as a marginalized student speaks to Homi Mahad's perspective in Parker's chapter on post-colonialism, that the fixity of stereotypes denies variation and change. Although Hooks still believed that learning could liberate, she experienced further disappointment in her undergraduate and graduate education, where her professors were not excited about teaching and had no clue that education was about the practice of freedom. The teacher's priorities were for the student to be obedient to authority, domination, and the unjust exercise of power, and to push marginalized students to conform and be clones of their white peers. This speaks to Foucault's model in Parker's chapter on historicism and cultural studies that power produces knowledge. To Foucault, power produces discourse rather than repressing it. Hooks was bored, and school became more like a prison, a place of punishment and confinement rather than a place of promise and possibility. She learned about the kind of teacher she did not want to become. This led her to imagine ways that teaching and the learning experience could be different. She discovered Brazilian thinker Paulo Freire and Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, who deeply influenced her work. For her, Freire understood that learning could be liberatory. Nhat Hanh's philosophy saw the teacher as healer. She used Freire's pedagogical paradigms to critique the limitations of feminist classrooms, where at times she experienced education as the practice of freedom. What helped shape her pedagogical practices, which emerged from a mix of anti-colonial, critical, and feminist pedagogies, was the idea that the classroom should be an exciting place, never boring. In the classroom, she learned that excitement is generated through collective effort and that everyone's presence is acknowledged and demonstrated through pedagogical practices. She also acknowledges numerous challenges and difficulties to make this happen, including the overall environment, resistance from students who don't want to learn or who don't want to learn any way other than the norm, the objectification of the teacher within bourgeois educational structures, and the undermining of education by teachers and students alike who seek to use the classroom as a platform for opportunistic concerns. To summarize, Dr. Hooks bears witness to education as the practice of freedom, declares that the pleasure of teaching is an act of resistance countering boredom, uninterest, and apathy, emphasizes that the classroom remains the most radical space of possibility in the academy, and celebrates teaching that enables transgressions, a movement against and beyond boundaries. It is that movement which makes education the practice of freedom. Our key word for today is transgression. Thank you for your attention. I'd like to acknowledge my sources of information for this presentation. I'd also like to thank Tanya Parnell for her invaluable assistance in creating this video and making it available online.